Since it is 4:01, we'll get this going, and we can have a cookie afterward too, either way. I'm Michael Berkman in the History Department, and I had the pleasure of working with Doug, essentially mentoring him in this summer project that he did a year ago. That he did it for me a year ago, that's going to result in a publication in a very good scholarly journal this year. Had nothing to do with Berlin, but Doug is going to share with you a little bit about the inspiration in wake of the attack on Ukraine and the response to it in Germany, which was similar to other countries in Europe and elsewhere, in thinking about preserving something for the historical record about how people were saying what they felt about the Russian invasion. And I think what Doug did was distinctive, creative, and very clever. And I think I need to introduce him no more than to say that we're just very happy as an exemplar of the history program at Gettysburg College to have Doug Harsha speak with you today.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. So yes, my name is Douglas Harsha, and today I'll be telling a story of how I saved a little portion of history last year in Berlin. Now, a brief bit about me. I'm a senior here at Gettysburg College. I'm a history major, CS minor. I'm the curator of the Cold War Museum in Flint Hill, Virginia. I'm on the advisory board for the National Museum of Civil Defense, and I am published in Washington History Magazine. Literally this week. Apparently they're printing it as we speak. So, last spring, in 2022, I was in study abroad in Berlin. I was there from January to May. And initially, I had a rough time adjusting. To be honest, my German's not great. But by mid-February, I'd kind of settled into city life in the center of Berlin. Major reason why I chose to go there was because of the city's history. I'm a history guy, and Cold War history especially is interesting to me. Can't really find a more impactful city to the Cold War than the formerly divided city of Berlin. So our story really starts on February 23rd with the most poorly timed photo I have ever taken. This is me in front of the Russian World War II Victory Memorial in Berlin. Less than 12 hours after I took this photo, Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine. I wasn't expecting it, not a lot of people were. But before we can go into that, I got to address the title of my talk. What is rapid response collecting? Well, before rapid response collecting, there was ad hoc collecting, which is really just a practice as old as time. It's people who find interesting items, recognize the historical value of something, have an interest in history, that on their own save and collect items from the current events of their time. Most artifacts in museum collections involve somebody outside of the museum sphere collecting an artifact for whatever reason at some point. Years and decades can elapse between somebody collecting an item and its way making its way into an institution. But this system has a lot of flaws. It's ad hoc, it's unorganized, it's not systematic in any respect. Sometimes it can result in damage to the artifacts. The most famous artifact in the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History is the Star-Spangled Banner. But that banner was privately preserved by a family for over a century prior to making it to the Smithsonian. In the meantime, people have cut all sorts of souvenirs out of that poor thing. Additionally, you lose a lot of the really important information surrounding the item itself. Its provenance, its historical context, the basic questions of who had this, when, where, doing what, are often some of the first information to go. The posters you see here in this exhibit from the Whitney Museum of American Art, we know they're posters protesting the Vietnam War. We can't say too much beyond that. We can't say, for example, who held this, where, or for what purposes. And more broadly, grabbing things ad hoc means there's an incredibly low chance of any particular item actually getting preserved. Most items do end up in the dumpster. Ad hoc collecting leaves a lot on the table. It's inconsistent and unhelpful. Rapid response collection is a response to this. It's a modern formalization of the practice coined by the V&A Museum in 2013. The Victoria and Albert Museum is a world-renowned design museum in London. And as a design museum, they had to react quickly to trends in the field. Designs change, fashions evolve very quickly. It's important to keep up. And especially, they wanted to document the evolution and the failures of design. You know, oftentimes the bad ideas disappear a lot faster than the good ideas. So, by developing this new systematic approach to collecting things from events as they happen rather than after the fact, they're able to collect artifacts such as umbrellas from the Hong Kong protests, clothing that was made in the sweatshop fires in India, and the world's first 3D printed gun, among other items. On-site collecting allows for more detailed and granular history than was previously possible. In effect, what we're doing is creating new curated primary sources for historians. The rapid response collection is a very new topic. It's still a hot buzzword, and it's flourishing in the wake of social movements, protests, and a growing awareness of their historicity. Smaller events are now being recognized as facets of a larger trend. Two examples of this are in the wake of George Floyd and the wider Black Lives Matter movement. The Levine Museum of the New South went out to protest sites in their area and started collecting artifacts, murals, artworks from the protests documenting the grief, anger, and mourning that was present in those days. Similarly, after the tragedy of the Pulse nightclub shooting in Florida, the Orange County Regional History Center collected both directly from the protests and the actual crime scene itself, getting access to the nightclub and removing items that documented the events of that day. So, I didn't do much on the first day of the invasion. I had an awful pit in my stomach. I had little hope from Ukraine. I don't think many people did at that time. I felt it was going to be a new invasion of Czechoslovakia. But eating dinner on the second day, I stumbled across an article that was written about a friend of mine, a curator over at the Smithsonian's American History Museum named Frank Blazich. The day after the January 6th riots, he had gone around the Capitol grounds and collected all sorts of discarded material that was left by the rioters. Signs, flags, crumpled up material from trash cans and the like. And in the year following it, his collection of material had become the single largest primary source of material from that event. It had become historically invaluable, the single largest collection of material from that day. And I realized I was in the exact same position. There were historic protests going on out there right now that ought to be preserved for the sake of the historical record. This pit in my stomach disappeared. I suddenly now felt that I had a duty to act, to say at least I did something, while incredible history was happening around me. But I was not the ideal candidate to do this sort of collecting in Germany. I'm a foreign student, don't really know anybody there. My German's not great. I can read it fine. Speaking it, my brain just locks up. I don't have any affiliations with like local historical organizations, museums, institutions. There's nobody I can really go to lean on for advice, resources, support. If I'm going to collect items, collecting indiscriminately could cause a lot of problems for myself. I don't know how the local protesters are going to react to seeing some college students show up and start picking up material. Somebody grabbing signs late at night can look awfully a lot like a thief, even if he is there for good intentions. And I was under a strict time limit because I figured by the morning the city's cleaning crews were likely going to remove all evidence of the protests. So my initial decisions were conservative. I was going to avoid all interactions with active protests. If there's an active protest going on, I was going to leave. I didn't want to deal with it. I didn't want to deal with any interactions. It was a risk I wasn't willing to take. I was only going to grab material that was clearly discarded or abandoned. I don't want to deal with problems of ownership. If I just find a sign lying on the ground, it's fairly obvious that whoever created or owned it has relinquished their claim to the item. I'm not going to be trying to grab things out of people's hands. But I also need to make sure the items I grabbed were still in good enough condition that they would actually be of use historically, that they could be displayed in an exhibit or similar means. So I wasn't going to grab signs that had been shredded to pieces or soaked with coffee or some other types. And finally, I was thankfully able to convince two of my fellow students studying abroad at the time, Alexander Remington and Joe Saliba, to accompany me. More pairs of eyes, and should something go wrong, at least I'm not out there alone. So in terms of what I'm bringing with me, I decided that in the interest of avoiding any problems interacting with the locals, I was going to make sure I was very positively identified as a museum curator. Now, maybe still technically a volunteer curator, but a curator nonetheless. So whenever I went out collecting, I would wear my museum uniform. I brought a shirt with me for business purposes unrelated. And I would always bring the business cards identifying me as such, along with just some basic equipment to protect both the material I collected and myself from the environment. That day it had been raining the entire day. I wasn't planning to let signs get soaked out in the rain. I figured the best place to go were probably in the areas with the largest symbolic importance in Berlin. Chief among them, the Brandenburg Gate. It's the natural site of protest, kind of like how the National Mall in Washington, D.C. is, there's a protest every day if you go down there. I figured the largest protest would offer the most chances to collect material. So, the other main consideration is, well, my memory is terrible. I knew that if I was successful in collecting material, I'd struggle to remember the finer details once I got back to my dorm. So, and I also wanted to document every single item I found in situ as I found it, because that in itself contains a lot of data about why it was left behind and its purposes. So I resolved to photograph absolutely everything. Any item I was going to pick up, I would photograph on location how I found it. And anything I couldn't collect but felt was important nonetheless, I would photograph for the record. So the first trip on the 25th was initially unsuccessful. My friends and I got out at the Unter den Linden subway station and we started walking to making our way towards the Brandenburg Gate. It was raining, and the first quarter mile of areas we checked, a lot of trash cans were either empty, full of normal trash, or some signs we did find were so rain-soaked they just disintegrated when we attempted to remove them. I was starting to doubt my planning. Maybe we had arrived too late, maybe the good material was gone or it was never here in the first place. But we lucked out once we got to the Brandenburg Gate itself. The two trash cans right out front had within them 3 signs, in pieces, but still perfectly fine, and a EU flag. This wasn't much, but it was enough to keep going. So we made our way down to the government complex, the main district, including the Reichstag building, the German Chancellery, and the like. It's the German government district. The green area between the legislative offices and the German Chancellery started yielding actual protest signs. This sign here with the purple and black visa was the very first actual protest sign I collected. The signs reflected some of the first major topics in the protests: shock and anger at the war, demands for sanctions. Both myself, Alexander, and Joe collected multiple signs this day. And when I get back to the dorm, I was thrilled. It was a success. I was incredibly tired. I was soggy. My coat was covered in yellow paint from a sign that was dissolving in the rain. But it was worth it. I had actual material from that day's protests. I got in contact with Frank, the guy at the Smithsonian, and he responded back immediately and positively, encouraged me to keep going farther. And I was determined to do so, even though for the rest of the week my dorm smelled like wet cardboard. When I got back, I immediately pulled the photos off my phone and extracted the GPS data from them. Using this GPS coordinates, I was able to produce an unparalleled granularity in my provenance data. I wasn't just able to tell you which protest it probably came from, I was able to tell you the exact park bench I found it on, hedge, piece of grass, stuck in a tree. I was able to achieve a level of detail that I had previously never encountered in a historical primary source. And this was a process I would repeat after every single collecting trip. Now, the first day I was successful, but that was largely due to luck. I didn't know if there were protests in the Brandenburg Gate. I had heard there had been some yesterday, but I was guessing that there might be some today. To ensure success on future trips, I needed a systematic way to know when and where the protests were occurring. I looked out and discovered that the Berlin Police Department maintains a website listing all of the active protest permits in the city. This site became a fantastic resource because, hey, it's Germany, even the protesters fill out the proper paperwork. Now, what this tells you is the date, location, and the title. So you can get a pretty good guess of where the Ukraine protests are going to occur and at their location. There's no evidence as to the size of the protest, but you can infer that based on location. The guys setting up at the Brandenburg Gate probably have more people behind them than the guys setting up at a shed somewhere outside the city. So the next day, the 26th, we went right back out. Joe and I arrived outside the Russian embassy after nightfall at 7 p.m. And we were caught off guard because there was still a protest going on. We had figured by that point the protest for the day had ended. We observed it for about 15 minutes. It was about 100 people. There was a lady with a megaphone shouting Slava Ukraini, glory to Ukraine over and over again at the embassy. Plenty of signs and flags. It seemed promising. I was hoping these people would leave behind some interesting items. But we're not going to touch an active protest whatsoever. So we left. I did not want to interfere with any sort of active protest, but in the previous days, from today and yesterday, it had become clear to me that some of the material I was finding might have actually been purposely left behind. How an item was left can let us infer why it was left. This is part of why this in situ, as found photo documentation was so important for me. These three signs here represent three different categories of abandoned material I recovered. The one on the left is just left in the grass. It's abandoned by the side of the road. There's nobody there. I believe I actually had to flip it over to show the text. The back of the sign was blank as I found it. That one is, I would consider, fair game. The one on the right is very unclear. It's in a park bench, like you're meant to walk by and read it, but it's also been shoved in the bench. Perhaps somebody set it up and then someone else knocked it over, or the weather got to it. It's unclear what's going on there. But the one in the middle is arguably the most important, because these are two signs that have been very clearly discarded so as to be displayed. It's clear here, they're set up against the side of the Berlin Opera House building. They're facing a public square. They've very deliberately been left behind by a protester so as to carry on their message after they had left. However, the city's cleaning crews would come and remove these signs by the early morning. So there's an issue here of interest balancing. The protester has the interest in having his message here conveyed at the very moment. As a historian, I have the interest of preserving them to document this protest and keep the message going on indefinitely. So when we came back to this site a few hours later, at about 10:30, the protest had ended and there were some signs left behind. Two of them here I saw were on park benches, clearly left behind as displays. These were pretty easy to collect. The two on the left, the ones stuck to the pole, were not. They were zip tied there. I couldn't remove them. I didn't have any scissors or anything like that. But these two examples, I had to consider my options for a long time as to what to actually do with these signs. Eventually, I reasoned that while I don't know who made these signs. It's not exactly like I can go and get the creator's permission. But if their aim in abandoning the signs to be displayed was in order to keep their message going as long as possible, then by collecting the sign, I can further that aim. I didn't think we were necessarily in conflict by taking them. So I took the signs on the park bench. This is one of them. I did not take the signs on the pole, but I did photograph them. I wanted to test something. I wasn't sure how much of an effect the cleaning crews actually had at this point. Well, the next day when I walked past this area again, those two signs were gone. That's the last I ever saw of them. And on that next day, something big was going down. Midday reports from Twitter I was seeing suggested about 80 to 100,000 people were in a massive rally down the Tiergarten from the Brandenburg Gate, as you can see in this photo. Alexander was even handed an advertisement for this protest the day before, and he gave it to me. If there was any time to collect, it was going to be now. Now, if I can find my mouse and play this. Oh, that's a shame, we don't have audio. But this is what the protest looked like during the day, and that is our sign. I'll get to how I got it later. Interestingly, I'll say now, I only discovered that when I was making these slides. Looking for that footage. So a year later, thanks to my documentation, I was able to confirm that this sign is the same one in the video. Here you can see all the people exiting with their material at the end of the day. So, whoop. Come on, advance. There we go. Before I could get to the protest myself, though, several of my friends had planned to attend the protest themselves as participants, and they offered to collect some of the material on my behalf. I was hesitant. I felt this was drawing the line between actively participating and interfering with the protest. I was a little uncomfortable with this initially, but eventually I agreed to take the material so long as they could give me photo proof that they weren't taking it from anybody, or they were collecting items that had been discarded or freely given to them, like the handout in the bottom left. I decided to bend the rules here a little bit because the value of collecting as much as possible from the largest and the most significant anti-war protest outweighed the risks of collecting from the active protest site. Besides this reason, I couldn't attend myself. I had a paper due that day. But at 9 p.m., I started to trek out once again. Concerningly, I found almost nothing on Unter den Linden, which is odd. That's the major thoroughfare in Berlin. It's got the Russian embassy, it's got the Brandenburg Gate. I wasn't finding much of anything. I was pretty concerned. So for the first time, I carried on into the Tiergarten, like Berlin's Central Park. It was a fairly unwelcome space that late at night. I felt very alone. The only people out there were the occasional scooters that hurled by and the silhouettes of people deep in the trees I didn't really want to have anything to do with. There were plenty of signs, but they were all destroyed, ripped up, overflowing out of trash cans and covered with various beverages. The deeper I walked down this road, the more uncomfortable I felt. I kind of wanted to get out of there. This isn't really my sort of environment. But near the very end, I suddenly came face to a massive banner lashed to a hedge. It was clearly left just to a display. Somebody went through a lot of effort to stick that thing by the side of the road. And it also had an incredible historical value. It's a direct allusion to the Ich bin ein Berliner speech given by JFK in '63. It directly compares his declaration in '63 with the current situation, saying, if he said I'm a Berliner, well, we are all Ukrainers. It is of incredible value historically because it makes a direct connection showing that the protesters were connecting their activism to the activism of prior generations. Historically, it was very significant. To say nothing the least, if it's a giant 8-foot banner, it's a fantastic display item. I couldn't give something like this up. So I made the decision there and then. A few more hours of it being displayed on the side of the street were not worth its eventual destruction. For its own sake, it was coming with me. And my luck held. On the way back, I found multiple signs in all sorts of places. The sign on the far left referencing cheese, some strange German pun I found on the leaning against the column of the Brandenburg Gate. The sign referring to refugees was against a currywurst stand outside the Russian embassy. But I was very worried. Somebody walking around late at night in Berlin with no signs is just a guy. Guy walking around with one sign is probably a protester. But I was walking down the street with a whole sheaf of signs under my arm. That looks rather suspicious. So I did my best to try and stay out of sight. If somebody was sitting on a bench, I went behind the bench. But I had to pause in front of the Russian embassy. There was a massive amount of signs all piled here, and I didn't know why. It's a little hard to see. This is a panorama I tried to take of it that night. The top's the original photo, the bottom's one where I cranked up the brightness. It's a large collection of signs, roughly hung up, like leaning against the fence line. And it seemed like an incredible resource. But it was also most likely going to be gone in the morning. It had probably coalesced spontaneously as people had departed the protest. One person leaves a sign, then a second, and a third, and once there's a pile, people keep adding to it. Various other signs were scattered around as well, and they didn't seem part of this main collection. They were put on random benches, left in the grass, and the like. But this pile of signs also still seems active in a way. People were stopping by, looking at it like they would an art gallery, taking photographs. I wasn't comfortable taking from it there and then. I decided this main collection, you see in the background there, was off limits. At the time, this was a difficult decision to make. I felt this was kind of a bad compromise for me because I was leaving a lot on the table. But at the same time, I wanted to be cautious. I didn't want to interfere with something I didn't entirely understand. However, the surrounding area had several signs that appeared valuable. They covered new topics that I hadn't seen before in previous material. They were printed. They were a marked increase of quality. These two, for example, were the first printed signs I came across. And they referenced new topics I hadn't seen before, like the airstrikes. I decided to collect 5 signs from the peripheral area surrounding this main pile. None from the pile itself, but ones that were scattered around on park benches and the like. It was the same reasoning as from the banner. I was convinced, based on seeing those 2 signs yesterday disappear, that it was either me or the dumpster. And surprisingly, I made it through without incident. Overall, the events of the 27th were by far the most difficult. It was a 3-hour ordeal, but it was the most rewarding. Some of the most visually interesting signs, the ones that tell you the most about what was actually being expressed in those protests, came out of this day, to say nothing less to the banner. I'll tell you what, this banner eventually ended up in the collection of the Smithsonian Institution. It's at the National Museum of American History. After the quiet drama of the 27th, I fell into a bit of a routine. I did some trips to smaller locations like Hermannplatz and JFK Platz, 2 smaller city squares kind of outside the central city district. But these yielded no material whatsoever, not even the slightest scrap to suggest there was a protest there, even though I saw there was a protest permit listed on the website. So I decided I was going to stick to the main areas. Each weekend, I would check the Berlin police website. Major protests occurred regularly in front of, major locations such as the Russian Embassy, the Brandenburg Gate, Unter den Linden, and they generally tended to happen on the weekends for obvious reasons. People are off work, and that worked out well for me because then I was off class. To avoid suspicion and ease the load, I would walk down the length of the collecting area one way, looking for signs, and then on the way back, I'd photograph and gather them all up. Anything I couldn't collect, I would photograph, documenting it that way. This was my main collecting area. It was a rough triangle from the Babelplatz on the far right, where it says German Historical Museum, all the way down Unter den Linden, the yellow road, until you get to the circle there, the Tiergarten, that's the Victory Column, and then north, in about a triangle shape, to the area around the Bundestag station. This was the main government quarter, and so plenty of the signs dealing with German politics I found around there. My trip on March 1st was pretty successful and uneventful. But on March 6th, I noticed a memorial of sorts had developed outside the Russian Embassy in about the same spot I had seen that pile of signs a few weeks earlier on the 27th. Some of the signs at least seem similar. You can see there's another copy of the Shelter Our Skies sign in the upper left of that photo. They've been pulled off. Some of them may have been pulled off the fence. They've added candles, flowers. And what was new is these signs had apparently survived a week straight, minimum, in the center of the street. It was unique in this regard. The cleaning crews hadn't touched it. It was pretty clear to me that this was an active memorial, and by its nature, it was equivalent to an active protest site. I decided this area was completely off limits for collecting. I felt it would be unethical to disturb a site of active mourning. Removing any item would be tantamount to damaging or desecrating it. So instead, I made a special effort to photograph this site and its evolution every time I passed by. This is how I first found it on March 6th. By March 9th, it's still there and somebody's added a bike. By March 20th, a few weeks later, it's grown considerably in size, and while it's a little hard to see in the center of the photo, somebody has made a custom street sign declaring this area of Unter den Linden in front of the Russian Embassy Freedom Square. And by April 2nd, about a month after I originally encountered it, it's developed even further. There is a hanging display of children's socks as a memorial to those killed in indiscriminate Russian airstrikes. There's also a section mourning the Bucha massacre, which was in the news at the time. More than a month later, that original circle of signs and candles is still there, undisturbed. And apparently, it's still there to this day. A few weeks ago, there was in the news that at this site in front of the Russian Embassy, a German artist has dropped off a destroyed Russian tank from Ukraine. That's a rather creative insult. But elsewhere during March, the collecting carried on. By March 13th, Joe joined me again for a trip, and I sent him up a tree to collect a peace sign that I had seen the week prior, but hadn't been able to pull down myself. Material was found in many places in many forms. The one on the left, my personal favorite, the only one I kept for myself, left on a fire extinguisher in the Babel plots. I love it because they just ran out of space. The middle, a fruit box wedged in a tree in the middle of the Tiergarten. And the right, just left in some grates in front of the Brandenburg Gate, 2 signs condemning the airstrikes. Sometimes quick thinking was required while collecting. This sign you see over here was 2 halves wrapped around a telephone pole and taped together like a sandwich. I couldn't remove it with just my bare hands. There's no real way to peel off the tape without destroying it. But I got the idea that to saw the tape apart through the edges using my keys for my dorm. Otherwise, sometimes I looked out and the fortunate placement of signs gave me some additional clues as to their origin. These 2 signs here I found on the same bench, and based on the handwriting, they were made by the same person. That's excellent. That's something I would have never known otherwise. But it was starting to wear down by the end of March. On a regular collection trip on March 20th, I saw that the Brandenburg Gate had been walled off. There were weird blue lights and a lot of music. I had to go through the side streets to work my way around to the other side. And it turns out there was a large charity concert going on that I didn't know anything about. Probably because it wasn't a protest, it was a concert, so it didn't show up on the website. I caught the last 5 minutes right before it ended at 11 p.m. Apparently it was an all-day affair. I thought this was fantastic. There's a crowd of hundreds here. I see plenty of protest material in the audience. As they clear out and dispose of items, I can pick them up right on the scene. Except for that entire crowd of hundreds, I only got a single sign. The very last item I collected. I counted at least a dozen in the crowd. Overall, the steady decline in material I was collecting at this point convinced me that the furor and energy in the Berlin protest movement had started to peter out. 2 prior trips that I had conducted to this had come up with nothing. And these weren't the smaller trips to the smaller locations. These were in the main area, absolutely nothing at all. And my family was actually planning to fly out to Berlin and visit me in April, so I needed to prepare for that. I was going to be their guide essentially, and needed to show them, how the subway worked, where the best dinner stand is, important information. So, and I also needed time to figure out how to ship this massive quantity of material I collected back to the US. Ultimately, this would take over a month. It was pretty difficult. In the final tally, I was able to collect 78 discarded items from 6 weeks of Berlin's protests from April 25th. That's supposed to be, February 25th to March 20th. This was 69 signs, which includes stickers and other display items stuck to various things, 6 handouts, 2 flags, and a banner. This was done over 14 collecting trips, 8 of which I was able to find material, 3 I did not, and 3 where I was only able to take photo documentation. Sometimes this is because I stumbled across active protests. Other times it was moments of opportunity. I visited my collecting area as part of class trips a few times, and so when I passed the memorial, I'd get photos then and there. And there were also some items that I did not get. I only collected material that had been discarded on site, which means things like the nicer signs, the professionally made protest banners, Ukrainian flags do not show up in my collection. Cheap cardboard and handouts are what predominate. It's understandable. A flag is eminently reusable. Use it once, use it again. Moreover, it would be a really bad look as a pro-Ukrainian protester to throw out a Ukrainian flag at a pro-Ukrainian protest. Some other items were just simply inaccessible to me. That sign I thought was real funny. Apparently fell between the elevator doors at Unter den Linden Station. That stayed there for a month because nobody could get it out. However, the most interesting things I never got were items from an apparent pro-Russian protest. So I had found out before it even broke on the news on March 26th that there was apparently a pro-Russian protest going on in front of the Reichstag. A friend of Joe's had let me know that he had seen Russian flags, and 2 hours later I got there basically as quickly as I could. And yet I found nothing at all. Nor was there anything in the whole of government district. I searched to the River Spray and back. I knew the cleaning crews were not involved because one, it's the middle of the afternoon, and secondly, I found protest material from the week before, like climate action material, still stuck in the bushes. So therefore, I had to conclude that either this protest was so small that no traces were left, or that it was so unpopular the locals removed any traces before I was able to get there. I suspect it might be a little of both. Here, the lack of material was about as significant as finding material would have been. But collecting the protest material was only half the job. In order to extract and record all the possible historical data, we need to do some mapping and analysis. So, I have a map. You're welcome to scan the QR code here if you'd like to see it for yourself. It's interactive, so you can click on any little dots and it'll show you what I found, when and where. But I also have some screenshots if you don't feel like it. See some phones out, I'll give you a second. All right. The documentation I took allows an extreme degree of precision in mapping the specific locations of protest material, with the blue dots you can see here. This lets us identify the individual popularities of various sites of protest. The Brandenburg Gate and the Russian Embassy were the most popular by far, with 18 and 13 items respectively. Locations suggest intent. A sign that's been left at the Russian Embassy may have different names from ones outside the German Chancellery. Excuse me. Mapping by date of recovery lets us link the signs to specific protests, catalog what topics are being discussed when, and also just note which trips they were collected upon. I categorized the signs by topics, creating rough categories that were based on their messaging. I also mapped the types of the material and the language of the various items I found. Unsurprisingly, most of the signs in Russian were concentrated out of the Russian embassy. But this also shows us that most of those signs were thus implicitly directed at embassy personnel. Spatial mapping reveals which messages were linked with which protest sites. Most of the signs dealing with German politics were found outside the Brandenburg Gate. Material referencing airstrikes was often found at sites in Berlin that had previously been associated with mourning, such as the Babelplatz, the site of the Nazi book burnings in the 1930s. The anti-Putin material, unsurprisingly, collected around the Russian embassy. Pro-Ukrainian material was scattered throughout. It was a common factor. Through trip-by-trip documentation, we're able to see how the protests and their messaging evolved over time. Without even looking at the news or outside context, we can see the progression of the war. Sanctions and aid early topics drop off completely, indicating protesters' demands were met. In fact, cutting Russia off of SWIFT and wider economic sanctions were some of the first responses to Russian aggression in the West. Aid also came fast, but Germany in particular hesitated. And this is mirrored by the increase in posters referring to German politics. This poster over here is essentially translate to Olaf Scholz, the chancellor at the time, grow a pair in reference to his unwillingness to send lethal aid to Ukraine. We can also see when Russia starts responding in the war with massive indiscriminate airstrikes. Airstrikes don't appear in the first 2 days of the conflict, but when Ukraine miraculously holds out at Kiev and the war transitions into a longer affair, we can see a massive reaction with the topic remaining strong until the very end of the collection period. Overall, what this table shows us is not only the evolution of the protests, but that the protests themselves were primarily reactive in nature. They were responding to breaking news and the war's developments pretty much as they happened. Even the drop-off in items at the end reveals when the movement lost steam as the war stabilized and the initial fury cooled off. Otherwise, by looking at the signs and language, we find something interesting. We're in Berlin, the capital of Germany, and yet almost 60% of the signs recovered are in English. My theory for this is that, while German may be predominant in Germany, English is still the lingua franca of the internet. Most social media online is in English, even in Europe. And a sign written in English can go a lot farther online than a sign written in German. Moreover, it looks better, it's easier to photograph, it's easier to disseminate to the amount of people in Europe that speak English as a second language. As previously discussed, cheap disposable signs and handouts predominated. Certain types of items, like all the flags you see here, were completely absent from the collection. And this means that there is some bias in the data. Since I was only collecting the material that was left behind, I can't purport to offer a full survey of what was actually being protested about. For every item I get, there's probably 100 or 200 items I missed. Finally, I was going to protests that had permits filled out with the police, which suggests at least some level of organization. But it turns out only a very small amount of material was actually involved with any sort of activist organization. Only about 11 items out of the 78. This suggests that most of the protests in Berlin were spontaneous, with the majority of participants being regular folk who were here on their own decision and not part of, say, larger activist movements or dedicated personnel. So eventually we got to bring this stuff back somehow. If we lose the signs when we leave at the end of my study abroad there, it's all for naught. And I'll tell you what, it cost about $250 in total to bring them back. The hardest part was finding a box big enough. I was gonna max out what DHL would let me send back to the US. And I had to go halfway across the city to find somebody that would sell me enough cardboard. So I was that guy on the subway that day trying to bring it back. About a 100-meter roll of bubble wrap, and I used every last inch. But I also had some decisions to make. These 3 items were all too long to fit in the box. I had tried to see if I could get somebody to take them locally, like the Berlin Story Bunker, but they weren't interested. So the situation became either I figured out something to do with these items so they were going to get destroyed when I left at the end, in May. I asked Special Collections actually what to do, and they told me, well, if it was this difficult to ship them, don't bother. That didn't really sit right with me. So I made the decision that it was better to damage the signs than destroy them. And I actually cut this sign in half with a kitchen knife. That let me fit it in the box and get it back here. And sure enough, it's part of Special Collections nowadays. In totality, I was able to get them all back to the States. 14 have ended up in the Library of Special Collections. The banner has ended up in the floor of the Smithsonian. That is the floor of the Smithsonian. You'll have to take my word on it. It was sent to me by Frank. This is really the end of my story, but I want to help you all create yours. Rapid response collecting is a fantastic way to preserve something in the news or currently happening that you care about for all time. There's really no barrier of entry so long as you go about the process carefully and deliberately. So I want to share just a little bit of what I've learned with my experiences in Berlin. Firstly, the overarching aim of this is that you'll be creating your own primary source for future historians, collecting artifacts while they can still be collected. So, before anything happens, I would recommend getting in contact with a local history organization, or one that's relevant to the topic at hand in your event. They can provide guidance, recommendations, resources, if it's even a good idea at all to try and collect. Have a plan for what you're going to actually try and collect when you're out there. What would you want in a primary source for this event as a historian? What accompanying information would you need to be documented? What would you need to go along with your items? Are you going to collect during or after the event? Are you going to collect in one location or multiple locations? Will you be actively receiving items or just finding them after the fact? All of these will affect the shape of your final collection. What material and thus information is going to be reflected and what's going to be left out. And be mindful of how the collecting might actually be received by the participants there. You may have to make decisions, as I did, on a case-by-case basis, considering, ethical, potentially even legal issues over whether or not something can be taken. Consider how the removal of items might be seen by the participants. While you're there, actively try and seek to avoid bias in the collection. And I don't just mean personal bias. I mean collect as many possible, opinions, statements, sides of the argument as possible to get as complete of a picture of what's actually being discussed at those events. If you're an active participant, identify yourself as such in your documentation. And as for documentation, there's really no such thing as too much. Provenance and immediate context are tenuous forms of data, and they're very easily lost. So many artifacts and collections, curators just simply have to shrug and say, yeah, we have it, that's about it. Granularity is incredibly valuable for getting deep down and providing as many details as possible to future scholars. Photographs, written accounts can preserve information that's not apparent in the material itself. By collecting, you yourself are now an eyewitness. And have a plan just in case something happens. Artifacts could get damaged, you get caught in the weather, you have an interaction with somebody that doesn't go too well. Bring equipment with you that can protect yourself and your artifacts from the environment. Especially weather, as I found. And finally, after the event, if you're going to be holding on to these items, ensure the short-term preservation of your collection. Keep your documentation in multiple places. That stuff is precious. You don't want to lose it to a bad hard drive or misplacing a file. And store the material in somewhere that's safe, dry, well ventilated at a moderate temperature. If it's comfortable for you, it's probably comfortable for your items. And if it's not, if you haven't already arranged this, find somewhere to send it. By holding on to it yourself, you make it inaccessible to everybody else. Identify a suitable museum or archive or some other organization that might be interested in this stuff and get in contact with them. Tell them what you have and what you might be willing to provide. If it's got to be moved or shipped, seek professional advice. Artifacts should never be damaged for the sake of convenience in storage or shipping. And finally, as a historian, consider what might be done personally with the collection to further scholarly understanding. You've essentially created a new source. This might be the fantastic basis for an article to introduce this to the scholarly community. I hope what I've discussed with you folks here is an interesting story, and along with some useful recommendations to go out there and preserve some history yourself. Thank you all for attending. Yes.
Doug, one of the best stories you told me when I interviewed you for the Libraries magazine was about the encounter you had. You were holding all this stuff with a woman who had just popped up and you hadn't expected to have anybody you had to converse with. I think, would you share that story with people here?
Sure. I had it in here, but I cut it for time. Sorry. So I only ever had one encounter with a local, really. And it was when I was in the station with a giant sheaf of signs under my arm, heading back to the dorm. Now, I had been very paranoid with my poor German skills of any sort of conversation unprompted. And so I actually had memorized a little bit of Google Translate German, trying to explain why I was there. And so when she approached me and asked to see the signs, I just kind of panicked and blurted out this Google Translate German to her, and it did not go over well. I think 3 words got across, and they were signs, collecting, and museum. But apparently those 3 were enough to get the point across, even if she had to pantomime placarden to mean signs. It was a short interaction. I was saved by the train arriving pretty quickly, but apparently I acquitted myself well enough that she left with a friendly smile rather than with suspicion. I was frankly relieved that that was the only encounter. Yes?
Is this something that you only started doing after you read that article, or is it something that you had been considering during things like COVID or recent other historical events?
No, I had heard about Frank's exploits, but I had completely forgotten about it by the time I went to Germany. Reading that article, it was literally just freeze mid-chewing in the middle of dinner with the realization that this is something I could be doing right now and that I really ought to be doing it right now.
So you ended with, you could be doing this, it could be the basis of a scholarly article. You spoke so eloquently about this whole experience. Have you started writing about it?
When I was in Berlin, actually, I was able to do an independent research project that focused on these signs. And so I have a bit of a paper already that discusses these in context, but it would take some work to bring it up to the standard of potential publication. But that is something I'm eyeing. I think it's a year on, but this is still, new enough and early enough that I think this would be fairly interesting for the outer scholarship. It's more just a matter of finding the time and the people that might find this interesting.
Doug, I was going to ask about the Smithsonian angle.
Yeah.
It sounds like you had somebody on the inside you could confer with, but, you know, how would a person who is doing the rapid collection actually contact the Smithsonian and say, I have X, or how did you do it? And what is your actual direct connection with the Smithsonian in terms of a gift of some of what you collected to the Smithsonian?
So, I happen to know one of the curators at the Smithsonian through my work at the Cold War Museum, because we had essentially the same area of interest in our research, civil defense. And it was just pure chance that he happened to be the person whose actions inspired me to do this. So I figured he was since, you know, I kind of owed this to him as giving me the example, he was the first person I contacted regarding these signs to essentially say, hey, I'm doing what you're doing, you know, would you like first dibs? And so I was in regular communication with him while conducting these collecting processes. I was bombarding him with questions and requests for advice and the like, and some of his responses helped decide how I was going to approach, you know, the future issues, you know, what to collect, what not to collect, problems like that. So actually, before I'd even sent the signs back to the United States, I had sent him this documentation. I had accumulated every single sign and basically said, take your pick. And eventually, through that angle, they came back and decided that their political history division would be very interested in the banner because of the JFK quote. And being very paranoid about DHL, I actually didn't mail that one back. When my folks arrived in April, I actually sent the banner back with them in their carry-on luggage, and they delivered it to the Smithsonian. In terms of going out there and getting in contact with a local organization yourself, in the US at least, Rapid Response Collection has really been more the focus of the local and the regional museums. They're the people that are very interested in the story of their own communities, and so when communities have these sort of major events, like protests and similar, they're usually the ones who are most interested. And since they're small institutions, there's really not much of most of them have a contact form or an email, as somebody you can email. And in my experience dealing with small organizations, they are just thrilled that somebody cares and that you're willing to help. Large institutions like the Smithsonian will generally have their own processes by which they'll have systems where you can offer items, and you know, they may say they want everything, they may want nothing. I can say, for example, I collected 78 signs, 15 are in collections. The rest, I am still looking for homes. Yes?
You're talking about your German language skills?
Yeah.
Of course you had Joe with you, and Joe would have been there to be your fluent translator on the ground.
Joe accompanied me on, I believe, 3 out of the 14 trips. Most of the trips were just myself.
Can you go back to your table you were showing, you're breaking down the signs?
Yeah, gladly.
Yeah. I'd like to offer what I hope is a friendly critique.
Yes.
Which is, I think our colleagues across the way in social sciences would probably quibble with you that the numbers you're showing are not large enough to be drawing conclusions. When you're saying like, oh, dramatic drop off from like 2, 4 to 1, and it's pretty idiosyncratic how you're collecting this material in the first place, I'm not sure that they would agree that those numbers would suggest that you could really read like political trends based on what you collected.
I'm not arguing these can show wider political trends. I'm more showing that the protests are reacting to those trends. It's a section, I spent a decent amount of my research paper discussing kind of the problems with this data. And yeah, a big problem is, I'm only picking random items I happen to stumble across on the street. I can't purport to have a comprehensive sample. I can only show what I've shown. And yeah, that would have to be taken into account. But the fact that is you can still see some changes along the evolution of the protest, I think serves as an excellent example as to why this sort of collecting is still valuable. If you can imagine if it wasn't just me that day, but if say there was a history organization that had maybe 20 or 50 volunteers out there collecting items, you you have a fantastic sample of what was actually being discussed and displayed. But at the time, it's just me. Yes?
So I'm trying to formulate this into a question. I don't know if I'm there yet, but it seems like a lot of the issues with contemporaneous collecting are similar in the end to some of the issues that museums and archives deal with the biases that are in our current collections. So you have that aspect of, you know, you, as you went through your process, imposed different rules on your system, but you were kind of figuring it out as you went. Maybe
Yes.
you couldn't collect the best example, but you tried to get a different example, or maybe the sign that was really great was covered in coffee, or, you know, whatever else. So like, and then how did you, I guess, do you feel like you were able to overcome some of those initial critiques of museum and archival collections with some of the rules that you imposed on your collecting, in terms of the biases and in terms of getting really good representation? I don't know if that comes out as a question.
Yeah, well, you are absolutely correct in the sense that I was making it up as I went
Yeah.
along. As I've discussed, there were multiple points where I had to stop and essentially figure out this whole new case of something I hadn't planned on. I was never expecting to find a giant pile of signs. I was never expecting to deal with these questions regarding intent and, you know, in the various categories of material that have been left behind. So, out there alone on the street, I was largely just trying to make the best decisions I could in the moment with what I knew at the time. If I was going to do anything again, if I was going to do this over again, the two things I would have really done were get in contact with like an actual history organization quickly and get somebody who knows better than I do involved in this. And, I've forgotten the second thing, but arguably that's more important. Maybe it'll come back to me. But as for the biases, I try to make a very active effort to collect at least one example of every topic I saw. Like if I had two signs and I could only carry one with me, I was picking the one that seemed more unique at the time. But then again, yeah, it kind of comes back to the previous question of I'm only one person, I'm only stumbling across what I'm stumbling across. I don't really have much agency in curating my collection besides just the basic decision of whether to, you know, grab it or not grab it in the moment. Yeah.
Did you come into contact with anybody or organization in Germany that was interested in your activity?
I tried. I reached out to organizations like the Berlin Story Bunker. I figured they'd be interested because they have a whole half of their museum that's dedicated to like the 1960s and their protest movements. So I figured, oh, that's a natural mix. The anti-war, anti-Vietnam protests of the 60s are kind of the natural predecessor to these modern anti-war protests. They were not interested. They were very rude to me, in fact, and so I did not follow up on that. And I wasn't able to locate anybody else that was interested by the time I needed to start preparing to return home from Germany. So by that point, I was just solely concerned of ship them back and I'll figure out what to do with them later.
Boy, are we glad.
Yes.
Thank you.
Can we get you or Professor Bowman or Joe to, for those of us who don't speak German, to translate the couple of things up here for us?
Sure.
We've
I can
got
do
this
a
one
few.
over here.
So the purple and black one you see here, the visa, this is visas for Russian deserters and families, which is interesting considering it's the second day of the protest. Visas for potential deserters seems like an odd immediate request compared to some of the other signs I found, which were like "Stop the war." The one with the cheese, I regret, I don't remember the exact translation off the top of my head, but essentially it talks about, it's a demand for sanctions, specifically sanctions on specific items that oligarchs like Belgian diamonds and Italian, luxury vehicles and things like that. European products that could be cut off from oligarchs. This one here, the one I split in half, reads essentially, in the Ukraine, Europe is being defended, therefore weapons for Ukraine. And that one over there which is in the mix of German and English, is essentially the I forget the Genügungsgrund, but it's the Olaf Scholz grow a pair, effectively. An attack on the Chancellor and the current government's hesitancy. All right, any more? All right, so that's it. Again, thank you all.